is on a holistic approach to sustainability from calf to the 5th lactation. So really focusing on nutrition. And when we say nutrition, not just nutrition of the milking cow, but nutrition and management of that calf all the way through to when she becomes a milking cow and hopefully enters her 5th lactation. So just a bit about me. This is where I live at the University of Nottingham on the dairy farm. My partner's the herd manager. And I became interested in sustainability. We live here, and you can see we're silaging in that field, and in the background is the power station. But that's the last coal-powered fire station in the UK, and it's due to be shut down at the end of this month and decommissioned. So actually, the world is waking up to sustainability, emissions, and that we've all got to do something, and that means the dairy industry too. So my partner, Nigel, you can see in that picture, he looks a bit weird. It was for a photo shoot. He was really anti-sustainability, like, oh, a load of rubbish. This is completely ridiculous. But on the other hand, he was like, oh, I'm really proud of Liz. She's got a new job as sustainability manager. But then, so a bit of a contradiction. But then when he found himself in the bottom 10% of the Tesco Arla dairy group, he kind of turned to me and said, what is it you do again? So that's where we started to look at carbon footprinting and reducing his emissions, and now he's all over it. And then also, why else am I interested in sustainability? Because I've got big ambitions, just like my daughter here, who's 5 years old, riding this giant horse. So I want to make the world a better place for her. And sustainability is a buzzword, a trend. I like to jump on the bandwagon. So my talk today, just go through some different systems, what we can do today to reduce carbon footprint, most importantly, how we can achieve this. How we can utilise the science and innovation that's been spoken about over the past 2 days, and then really what's stopping us from getting started. So I'm not going to recap all of this. This is a slide from Koen's presentation, but it is really important. There's lots of legislation that we need to adhere to, ourselves as Nutraco, compound feed factories, and then what we do on the at farm level. And most companies are signing up to science-based targets. The retailers and processors are signing up to reduce their emissions, and actually 98% of their emissions comes from the farm gate. So that's why we as advisors have to really help at farm level and look at what we can do. And it won't be the same on every single farm, and we can see there's lots of different systems. But really important to say, not one system is more sustainable than another, not grazing or housed, dairy or beef, but actually all of these individual systems can become more sustainable. They can do something to reduce their carbon footprint, and often we can look at it in terms of the people, profitability is really key, and the planet as well. So today I'll talk about carbon footprint. The others, Brian and Koen, have mentioned about other things related to sustainability, but today that's what I will focus on. So there's many challenges facing dairy farmers at the moment. If you asked ChatGPT what the job of a farmer is, it comes up with a massive list of mechanic, nutritionist, bookkeeper, etc. It goes on, and now added to that list is environmental consultant as well. They've got to make decisions about the environment in their fields, but also about how to reduce emissions and also make money and run a profitable business. So Arla have introduced their sustainability program. Many other processors are doing similar things, and it's another additional list of things for farmers to adhere to, but it really links through to sustainability and efficiency. Then we've got regenerative agriculture, whatever that really means. If you Google it, there's no real definition, but it's all about soil health, looking after the environment, and there's many schemes in place there. Another thing on the farmer's plate is that they're now being asked to plant multi-species swards and herbal lays. Now actually, that's really good. Really nice, you can see the roots there on that picture for nitrogen fixing, but many farmers are not really being advised on how to do it. And then the banks are getting involved as well, promoting regenerative farming and how these farmers can then get loans to progress their business. Then we've got soya and EUDR, variability and volatility in prices and availability of ingredients and raw materials, and then another challenge to turn a profit. So hopefully today can kind of take you through some strategies to reduce footprint and also bring money to the farmer as well. So what can we do today? So we can start with the calf by unlocking genetic potential, look after that heifer, helping her to calve down at 22 to 24 months, help the cow through the transition period with a reduced incidence of challenge and disease, then in the milking cow, sustain that peak yield, and hopefully go on to complete a healthy fifth lactation. But again, here I've just given targets. I've not really said how. And that's where we're at today with the process of environmental footprinting, measuring, collecting data, measuring again. What we really need is that decision-making process in the middle and action plans. And I think that's where everyone in this room can contribute at giving advice on farm in these particular areas. So, what does make up the carbon footprint per kilo of fat and protein corrected milk? You can see on this picture here, in the green we have feed, in the dark blue there's enteric fermentation, manure management, a small 10% in the orange, nitrous oxide, and then energy. But the main takeaway from this slide, and it can vary depending on the farm and the situation, but really 80%, so if we add up the enteric fermentation and the feed, roughly 70 to 80% when you're doing footprinting comes from feed and nutrition. So that's the diet that the animals eat, purchase feeds and the emissions associated with those, formulation of the diet, much like what Jan was saying, the number of animals eating that diet, and then the efficiency of those animals to convert that feed into milk. So as we go through, I've got an example of a GB herd, because that's where I'm from, starting at 1.2 kilos of fat protein corrected milk and an 100 cow herd. So we'll use that as an example for some emission reduction as we go through. But firstly to say, it all starts with young stock. We need to build that calf, feed her properly, much like Javier and Isla were talking about in their talks. And you've seen this slide before. So really, we've looked at feeding elevated planes of nutrition versus restricted planes of nutrition. And you can see differences in gene expression and differences when unlocking the genetic potential of that cow. Now that leads to many health benefits and also production benefits. So for every 100 grams of average daily gain in the first 2 months of life, you can expect approximately 225 kilos of extra milk in the first lactation. And also there's other associated benefits there too, and those animals generally tend to calve down earlier. So what does this mean in terms of that carbon footprint and the impact on emissions? So I've shown here in this table, you can see along the top, we have age at first calving, so going from 28 to 26 to 24 to 22 months. And you can see in our 100 cow herd, you generally need fewer replacements and fewer calves. Therefore, that's less animals on the farm to feed and less emissions. So when we go from 26 months age at first calving down to 22 months, we can calculate that as a 6% reduction in carbon footprint. And actually that could bring around £32,000 profit to that herd, along with sold animals, less feed, etc., and more yield, as we've seen. So we have a 6% reduction. And you've already seen this slide from Javier and Isla as well, but actually when we feed those animals an elevated plane of nutrition versus a restricted plane of nutrition, they go on to last in the herd for much longer. So there was more animals left in the herd at fifth lactation. I think it was 20% of the animals on the elevated plane of nutrition versus 7% of the animals on the restricted. So, and they've lived for roughly extra 300 plus days. So this is really important. Those animals are healthier, they survive longer. So what does this mean for replacement rates and therefore the impact on footprint? So we can generally shift the replacement rate down to around 20%. And if you look here, you can see, I think there's 27 fewer animals needed for a 20% replacement rate against the typical average of 33. More of those animals are in later lactation, so a much higher milk yield. We've sold some animals, again, less feed and less followers. You don't need as many young stock coming through into the herd because they're much better and they last longer. So we've got a 5% reduction in footprint and a profit of around £72,000. So we've talked about healthy life and surviving to the next lactation. And Lance spoke a lot about culling in the first 100 days. And the effect of survival has a huge impact on that footprint. So all these reasons for culling typically came out of this paper. As we know, mastitis, lameness, poor milk yield, metabolic disease. But really, we shouldn't be treating the end disease. We should be looking much further forward. And I just collected here replacement rates from several people in the room from the local markets that I work in. And you can see we're at 33% on average, up to 40%. And actually that 33% as an average, there's a few better, but there's many much worse. There's a huge spread. So what do we do about it, and how do we get to the next lactation? And what does it mean for that footprint? So we talked a lot yesterday about prevention, about looking after those animals. So I've just plotted this and modelled it in Milkprint. It's a study by JB on looking at a post-calving drink. So they looked at 10 commercial farms in the Netherlands, 500 cows per treatment. Treatment 1 was a calcium energy supplement versus treatment 2 was a placebo. So what they found was actually with the calcium energy supplement, 81% of animals actually drank that drink voluntarily. Only 50% drank the placebo treatment. But you can see, mainly here, that increase in milk yield was around 1.5 kilos per day, and the milk protein around 57 grams per day, when they were looking at predicting residuals, so actuals versus what the animals were predicted to do. So we just kind of modelled this in Milkprint based on the study data and found an approximate reduction of around 2%. So that's pretty good if we just do one simple action, such as feeding a post-calving drink. Those animals tend to have higher energy-corrected milk, and this dilutes the footprint. And Victoria spoke about protecting hindgut health and all the different stresses that we see on dairy farms. So one of the studies that she presented was around the post-rumen prebiotic improving milk performance. So the other study from the Netherlands, I think it was, but again, a 1.1 kilo increase in milk yield and a 0.4 increase in protein. So again, being proactive with those animals could then lead to a 4% reduction in carbon footprint. So this was modelled using my Milkprint on the average GB situation, and this is what we've seen in real life on farms as we feed that product today. There's also positive effects on fertility and effects on replacement rate that have not really been modelled in here, so that effect could actually be much greater. And then we have heat stress scenarios. So there was a lot of discussion yesterday around heat stress. So typically in the UK, we do get heat stress, but not as much as in Italy. So I've taken this data from our Italian colleagues when we did some work there over the summer. And in their heat stress data, typically they'll see reductions of 1.5 kilos of milk, 0.2 in butterfat, 0.1 in protein, and a reduction of 15% in conception rate. So looking at their baseline, which is on the left of that graph, and a heat stress scenario, actually we can reduce footprint by 6% if we actually just look at proactive strategies to reduce heat stress. So that could be prebiotic to protect the animals, it could be betaine, as we were discussing yesterday, or generally cooling, if you can, fans and sprinklers. And really, this effect, based on yesterday's talk, is actually really conservative, because in this model, we've not really looked at the effects on the calf that was in utero and heat stressed, or on the impacts on the grandchildren, etc., going forward. So this could be a lot worse, modelled only on milk production alone. So what do we want to do with these animals? We really want them to complete a healthy fifth lactation. So this graph just shows that the third lactation is optimal for genetic expression. So you can see that here. So optimal for genetic expression. But the fifth lactation is really optimal in terms of minimal age cow. I don't know whether it's actually working. Oh, there. Minimal age cow cost and loss of genetic gain, for example. So fifth lactation is really optimal, and that's a low herd replacement rate at 20% with voluntary calls. So I think that's where we should really be aiming for, but it all starts with the calf and then managing her through that transition period. So, as I said at the beginning, we've got our 100 cow average GB herd, starting at a 1.2 kilos of carbon footprint per kilo of fat protein corrected milk. So with Life Start, we can get a reduction of 6%, and with Healthy Life, a further reduction of 5%. I should probably say here that actually these effects will not be completely additive on every single farm, but in this example, we'll take it through bit by bit. So the next important area, really important, is precision nutrition. So we'll look at reducing the impact of feed. I'm not going to cover methane-reducing diets because that's already been done really well already. We can improve feed efficiency, model responses to nutrients, and then reduce waste via negative interactions. And all of these have small impacts on the footprint, but when they add them up on a particular herd, we can make big gains. So where do the impacts or emissions come from in feed? Most of them come from ingredients, well, pretty much all of them. You can see transport, feed production, packaging, and transport to the farmer are such a small part of that footprint. All of them come from that country of origin and the impacts that have gone into growing that feed. So fertilizer, tractor time, diesel, etc. And then the distance travelled to the feed mill is relatively small. So here we have an example, Allard actually did this graph, on the effect of sourcing of raw materials. So here on the left, we have, firstly we have two compounds. They've got the same nutritional composition and the same formulation. On the left here, we have the soya from Brazil and the PK from Indonesia, and on the right, the soya from the US and the PK from Malaysia. And I don't know if you can see, but the footprint has decreased from around 1,300 kilos per ton in the feed to 750 kilos per ton. So that's almost half. So that has a massive impact and also can reduce the end footprint per kilo of milk by 9%. So really highlights the importance of having accurate feed data in our footprinting calculator tools so that everybody knows exactly what we are feeding and where does it come from. Now I've used soya as an example here, but the main takeaway would be that halving the footprint of your feed by whatever formulation means you do and maintaining production can reduce your footprint by around 9%. We also need to balance these diets. This is just some modelling work from the GB lab, taking the top 20% of foragers versus the bottom 20%. And we looked at energy and protein, balancing the diet, and really with a good quality silage, it meant that 2 more kilos could be fed. This meant that we could feed less compound, so 1.3 kilos, and we reduced the footprint by 3% in this example. Now that's actually really conservative. We could do much more with this, and we could do much more day to day when we're looking at diets on farm. So instead of just formulating, really looking at the impact in terms of your scope 3 purchased emissions, and then also the methane emissions from these diets as well, because it will all contribute, the effect will be much greater. And we just have an example here of a farm we've been working on in the UK, and these are the different impacts per diet that are being fed. They're actually all being fed now. We started out at 37 kilos of carbon footprint equivalent for one diet, and you can see that big green block is the footprint of the compound that was being fed, and that compound was actually 2,000 kilos per ton, which is very high. When asked why, well, my nutritionist didn't really know about footprinting. He's always done it this way. We don't really know, we've never thought about it. Well, actually, that's probably why you're in the bottom 10% with Tesco. So we set about doing some work, sacked the nutritionist, and started to reduce the footprint, and most importantly, managed to reduce the impact of that diet whilst maintaining performance. So production levels have not changed as we've gone through, and there is more work to be done. And this overall added to a reduction of 10%. So hopefully when the audit comes around next year, we've predicted that we're now going to be in the middle band, with more room for improvement to go to the top, looking at age at first calving as the next thing to focus on. So we've kind of looked at feed, looked at the impacts. We should also be looking at how we can get animals to utilise that feed more efficiently. So I just modelled this. There's a 2 kilo difference in dry matter intake here. So we know a lot of the genetics companies are doing a lot of work on residual intake, and how this feeds through and getting more from less and lower inputs. So we want the animals that are eating a healthy diet, producing more milk, but we don't really want those animals that are eating lots of that diet and not giving any milk. So here I've just modelled the difference between 2 kilos dry matter intake on the end impact per kilo of milk. And you can see it's a 7% reduction. So effectively maintaining the output and reducing the inputs. We can also do this the other way. We can increase the output per unit. So here we can increase the milk yield by 10% and you get a reduction in carbon footprint by 10%. It kind of makes sense, it's just a dilution factor. But the question we need to be asking ourselves is how do we increase that milk yield and how do we increase the yield whilst keeping all of the inputs? How do we increase that yield without putting more inputs in? That's what I'm trying to say. So we've talked about rearing the calf properly, we've talked about the transition period and the small changes where we can achieve big gains in reducing that footprint, but also in that diet. So this picture, you can kind of see the cow can't reach the food. So that's a simple management task. We can push up feed more regularly. We could look at moving head rails, for example, to allow the animals to eat. But we should also be focusing on formulation. So all cows, when you go to the farm, are eating a diet which has hopefully been nicely balanced, and we've balanced the rumen. Traditionally, we would ration 40 litres for a cow that's giving 35, and we can no longer do that. With the extra pressures from incentive schemes looking at protein efficiency and feed efficiency, we really need to be asking ourselves, are we feeding for marginal litres, and are we being more precise as we go? So you can see here on this axis, we're looking at profitability. And here on the bottom axis, we've got compound feed, feeding energy, and compound feed with protein. And if I just look here, the question we're asking is, when does feeding more feed, when does feeding concentrates become unprofitable in this situation? So you can have two farms both doing 35 litres, one farm is making money and one is not. So the question we're asking is, here, this farmer, or this particular situation, if we start to feed more energy and more protein via the compound, actually we start to diminish in terms of profitability, but also production. We're not getting any more for our money, and our emissions start to increase. Whereas the graph on the other side shows where it is profitable. If we feed more feed, we get more milk, and then we dilute those greenhouse gas emissions. So really, the question we should be asking is, what response are we getting? We shouldn't just be feeding a set level, we should be looking at responses. And this is a slide from JB, but we should be looking at milk yield responses rather than absolute. So you can see here, these are all different responses to 10 kilos of concentrate. And actually, it's a bit of a mess, it's all over the place, they're all different, there's not a consistent response. The question we should be asking ourselves, and particularly when we're rationing for those farmers on incentive schemes where they are being looked at by protein efficiency, they are looking at the energy inputs, they are looking at the feed that's going in, is how much more milk will we get from 1 kilo of concentrate? So how much more milk? Will that be profitable? Will that increase my emissions, or will it dilute my emissions, and what does it do? So really decision making in terms of productivity, profitability, and the planet. And then we're getting to the end now, on a little bit on responsible minerals, as we've heard about on the first day. We know that typically we're feeding copper supply above the net requirement. What should we do about it? There was many suggestions throughout the week, looking at different formulation levels, but ideally we need to be here in the optimum health range. We need to work that out for our individual farms. And a perfect way to kind of do this would be to look at responsible minerals. So formulating the total mineral package for a reduced impact per tonne, whilst also maintaining milk yield and not having any negative interactions. So that's looking at all levels of minerals, so phos, as we were talking about before, but also your copper, manganese, and zinc, and really making sure we're not overfeeding and therefore excreting into the environment. So that's one way. But Carlin and others spoke about earlier, sulfates, where they dissociate in water, and what negative impact could this have on the rumen? So Kevin has done some nice work looking at the Intellibond meta-analysis, and we've seen improvements in digestibility. So those improvements in digestibility have actually led to improvements in milk yield. And that has led to a reduced impact in terms of carbon footprint of around 1.5 to 2%, mainly because the yield is improved, there's improved benefits on your calving interval and a slight improvement on replacement rate as well that has been modelled. And in this LCA, it's actually been approved by Professor Krabab of UC Davis. So this hasn't just been modelled in Milkprint, it has actually been approved. So finally, I hope in my talk I've addressed kind of what we can do here and how. So really we need to stop just measuring and getting that number. We do need a number to start from, but then we need to look at what to do with it and make an action plan going forward. And we need to really focus on what-if scenarios. So get that number. Then, as you can see in this middle line, what are the different impacts per farm? And we've picked the top 3 here. And you can see they all have different reduction potentials for that individual farmer in terms of footprint, and also different profitability. So the farmer can choose what's going to be a quick win, where will it make me money, what is the impact on that footprint going to be. So every little impact will take a different amount of time for it to be realized in the LCA models and the footprint calculators. So short term, we can really focus on the impact of compound feed, ration formulation, forage quality, and methane reducing additives. In the medium term, potentially improvements in transition, so reducing culling rates, improving fertility, and improving that milk yield and constituents. And then more longer term, we can decrease that age at first calving, so it will take around 2 or 3 years to come through. Reduce those replacement rates, and in turn that will increase your lifetime daily yield, as we heard about earlier in the week. So we can do all this on our route to 2030, which is actually not that far away, so 6 years away, and we've got to roughly reduce emissions by around 30% in the total milk pool. So we can do it, we have plenty of solutions, but we must start today. And then just to summarise, we've already seen these for Lifestyle and Healthy Life. I've kind of averaged the precision nutrition impacts around 10%, the environmental footprint, so just changing the impacts of feeds and sourcing, 9%. Deliberately not spoken about methane reducing additives because it was covered, but it is an important piece of the puzzle once we've done everything else. So you can see on an individual farm, we could probably achieve 30% reduction. We can decrease that footprint, increase efficiency, and then increase profitability as well. So finally, what can we do today? We have loads of tools already available. We can focus on colostrum, volume intake, and quality CMR. With the heifer, let's not forget about them and just chuck them out to grass in the GB situation. Let's continue to feed them so that they grow and they're on their target weight to calve down at 24 months. With the transition cow, we can look at mineral supplements, post-calving drinks, and then being proactive rather than reactive. With the milking cow, let's focus on forage quality, as we heard earlier, balance that diet, and then look at responses. Don't just put extra feed in and hope for the best. Look at responses to energy and protein. And then hope to get to that 5th lactation, so where we consider feed additives and methane reducing additives to prolong the life of that cow. So, thank you for listening.